Howdy folks, welcome back to War Thunder with the mighty Jingles. This is the hilariously named Soviet Bear Stronk, who is ironically enough flying an American aircraft, the P-80 Shooting Star, developed by the Lockheed Corporation, often referred to as America's first true jet fighter. Not actually America's first jet fighter, that particular honour goes to the Bell Corporation's P-59 Aerocomet. The only problem with the Bell Corporation's P-59 Aerocomet was that it was crap. It was absolutely terrible. It got outperformed by piston-engined aircraft like the P-51 Mustang. The Shooting Star, on the other hand, it wasn't bad. There's quite a story around how this thing was developed, actually. At the time, American jet engine technology, and it's quite hard to imagine it now, given how, incredible American designs are. But in the post-war years and the latter years of the Second World War, America lagged far, far behind in jet engine technology. The P-80 was actually designed to use a de Havilland Goblin engine, a British engine. Unsurprisingly, the British were second only to the Germans in jet engine development, and led the world for the first decade or so after World War II. And most early American designs actually used British engines. But they didn't have access to the engine. So they actually designed this aircraft around an engine that they didn't have. Lockheed had actually submitted proposals for the new design of their jet, but with the Bell P-59 Aerocomet entering service, the US Air Force, or the US Army Air Force as it was at the time, weren't interested. They didn't want to pursue two different development lines. So they said thanks, but no thanks. Oh boy, did they regret that decision. With the Aerocomet being the disaster that it was, they turned around to Lockheed and said, okay, how fast can we get it? And Clarence Johnson said, you'll have it in 180 days. Now that's a fast development time. This was basically the birth of Lockheed's famous Skunk Works development laboratory, and shrouded in the utmost secrecy. I mean, the British engineer who delivered the engine ended up being arrested by the police because the Lockheed engineers couldn't vouch for him. That's, how serious they took the secrecy. Of the engineers that worked on the project, only 5 of them actually knew they were building a jet. And they delivered it in record time. The development cycle for this aircraft was ridiculously short. I mean, Kelly Johnson promised the government that they'd have it in 180 days, which is ridiculous, but they actually delivered it in 143, which was just amazing. Development wasn't completely problem-free, of course. If you were to go to the P-80's Wikipedia page, for example, it would tell you that the first de Havilland Goblin engine, once it was delivered and fitted to the aircraft, and they were running through some basic engine exercises on the ground, it was destroyed by a foreign object that got sucked into the engine intake and destroyed the turbofan. Well, that's not strictly true. The engine did get destroyed when something got sucked into it, but it wasn't a foreign object. The de Havilland Goblin engine produced so much suction that the intake fittings of the airframe were being pulled into the aircraft itself. There was a bit of finger-pointing went on between Lockheed and de Havilland, the people who manufactured the engine, but they went ahead, revised the intakes, countered the problem, but it did delay the project. We're just going to interrupt the history lesson here for a moment because Stronk Soviet Bear in the P-80A has finally got within spitting distance of his first enemy aircraft. Not sure what it is just yet, but there's somebody, he's just lost him in the clouds, but he's going to close the distance. Japanese, by the way, because this is the realistic battle set on the New Guinea map, so it's Americans versus Japanese, and there are 2 of the new Japanese aircraft in this mission, the J7W and the R2Y2, and I think that's a J7W1 up in front of him. Bizarre looking aircraft. It was a piston engined aircraft, but the engine was at the back. It was a pusher rather than a puller. There it is. Yep, there it is. You can see it's got the canards at the front and the wings and the engine at the back. Now he's fired and missed. That guy's gone into a steep dive. He's trying to follow him around. The other Japanese aircraft in this particular game is the R2Y2, although I'll probably end up calling it the R2D2 because, you know, reasons. Um, and it did exist, but it didn't exist in the form in which we see it here in War Thunder. In War Thunder, it has two jet engines. The real thing, well, it had two engines, but it only had one propeller. It was never a jet-engined aircraft. It was unusual because it had two engines powering one propeller at the front, where the propeller should be, unlike on the J7W, who's given strong Soviet Bear some severe problems here. The R2Y2 was an utter failure. It just did not meet performance expectations, so the design was shelved. A couple of prototypes were built. It was suggested that to fix the problems with the aircraft, they should go ahead and fit a pair of jet engines under the wings instead. But no prototypes were ever built. You can, however, fly it as a sort of what-if aircraft here in War Thunder. Meanwhile, back at the Skunk Works, Kelly Johnson's team had managed to get their hands on the only other spare de Havilland Goblin engine in existence, fitted it to the airframe, fixed the problems with the engine intakes, and produced the prototype of the first American production aircraft that was capable of exceeding 500 miles per hour in level flight. It couldn't quite claim the honour of being the very first American aircraft to exceed 500 miles per hour in level flight because the Republic Corporation had specially designed one P-47 Thunderbolt with the express purpose of doing just that, and it did manage to get 502 miles per hour. But that was a one-of-a-kind aircraft. The P-80 was the first production assembly line aircraft on which every single aircraft that rolled off the assembly line could be expected to match and exceed those speeds. And he's got the J7, and he hasn't got the J7. God damn it. Oh well. And that right there is a perfect example of one of the main problems of these early first-generation jet engines. They did not respond quickly to changes in throttle settings. They were slow to wind up and they were slow to wind down. The J7 pilot, all he had to do was throttle back and just watch strong Soviet Bear overshoot him. Of course, the good side is that because strong Soviet Bear and the P-80 was going so fast, the J7 pilot only had a limited window of opportunity in which to bring his guns to bear on him. He's managed to break contact quite cleanly. In fact, it was often the case, particularly on the ME-262 for example, that trying to make rapid throttle adjustments would flame the engine out, and you would end up flying a very, very heavy glider. The pilots who were expected to fly these things had massive problems adjusting to, well, how these things should be flown, completely differently from a piston-engine aircraft. The dogfighting aces in their Spitfires transitioning to Gloucester Meteors, and the P-51 Mustang pilots transitioning to the P-80 Shooting Star, had all kinds of problems trying to fight the instincts that they developed through years of flying Spitfires and P-51s and resisting the urge to try to make rapid throttle changes on these first generation jet engine aircraft, because otherwise they'd just flame the engine out and they'd wreck the aircraft. Another problem that a lot of them had was because they were so used to listening to their engine, they were so in tune with the aircraft that they were flying, they could tell what speed they were doing by the kind of noise the engine was making. Well, that was gone. There's no big noisy propeller in front of them anymore that's helping to tell them how fast they're going. So they had to learn to, well, basically judge their speed by keeping one eye on the airspeed indicator all the time, something that most of them just weren't used to doing. It was an intensely frustrating process for a lot of these hardened World War II combat veteran pilots. You know, they were experts of their craft, and then suddenly it was like going back to school for them, and oof, that was close. That was one of the R2Ys. And if you actually have a look at the scoreboard here, strong Soviet Bear is not in a very strong Soviet position. His team's just lost another aircraft, and that is not good. That is not good at all. He is, in fact, the last member of his team flying, and there are, count them, 7 enemies, and 5 of them are in jets. Yeah, this is going to be interesting. So, yes, learning to fly this new aircraft was actually a very dangerous proposal. Particularly, it was probably more dangerous for the combat veterans than for new pilots who were learning to fly this thing for the first time, because the combat veterans had all kinds of bad habits. Well, habits that were great habits if you were used to flying a piston-engine aircraft, but could get you killed when you moved on to something like this. A new pilot, for example, that didn't have any old habits, could be taught how to fly this thing properly, fresh out of the book, for example. In fact, America's top scoring World War II combat fighter ace, Major Richard Bong, was killed while taking an acceptance flight in a P-80. He simply forgot to turn the fuel pump on. The engine died, and he was killed while bailing out. And Major Bong was sadly joined by lots of other American pilots who died flying the P-80 under non-combat conditions. This was a dangerous aircraft to fly. It killed a lot of its pilots. But that wasn't unique to the P-80. The Royal Air Force had exactly the same problem with its Gloucester Meteors. The ME-262 killed a lot of its own pilots. This was new technology. New technology has a habit of going wrong. And if something goes wrong when you're flying at over 600 miles per hour, well, it doesn't leave an awful lot of margin for error. Meanwhile, back to the action. Strong Soviet Bear in a not very good position whatsoever, heavily outnumbered. He's putting this thing into a maximum speed power dive. Now, the P-80 in War Thunder, and he's pulling some serious G-forces there, pulling up out of this dive, and then going into a dive and pulling a high G turn as well. He's doing this for a reason. The P-80 in War Thunder is not particularly good. Like most of the first generation jets, all it really has going for it is its good top speed. But it is outstanding in absolutely one respect. And if you have a look at the combat messages, you will see that 2 of the enemy aircraft have just crashed. What the hell have they crashed into? Strong Soviet Bear is the only friendly plane still flying. What they've actually done is that they've been in such a hurry to get over here and descend from altitude and catch him that they've ripped their wings off. And that is precisely why Strong Soviet Bear is going so fast and so low, because he knows the kind of speed that these guys are going to build up in the dive, and he can pull a high G turn in the P-80, and the P-80's airframe can take that kind of punishment. Same can't be said for the pilot of the R2Y2 behind him. Sucker! You see, the one thing most of these early jets are very good at is going very, very quickly. The one thing most of them are not very good at is suddenly not going very, very quickly. Their airframe cannot take that kind of strain. The P-80s can. And that's why he's throwing this thing through these high-speed, tight turns, putting enormous stress on the airframe. There goes another one, another 2. His airframe can take it. Theirs can't. Now look at the speed that R2Y2 has built up in that dive. He overshot the target, and the first thing he does is he starts turning all that speed back into altitude, but he's putting enormous negative G's on his airframe. Meanwhile, now the Ki-84 on the other hand, that's an entirely different proposition. It's a prop-engined aircraft. It's entirely capable of taking, well, it's not generating as much G-force in the turns because it's not going as quickly, and it's a dogfighter. It's able to match him in the turns, even if it can't catch him on raw speed. But watch, here comes the R2Y. Look at the speed in the dive. He's trying to turn inside him. He's trying to match his turn. Oh, wings have fallen off. P-80 can take it. Most other early jets cannot. He's actually managed to write off 4 enemy aircraft without firing a single shot, just by making them crash. Unfortunately, he's got a Ki-84 on his ass now, and he is losing a lot of speed pulling these high G turns, so the Ki-84 is now able to keep up with him and easily match him in the turns. And the one biggest problem, in my experience, with the P-80 is that it seems to be made entirely out of fuel tanks, because the second this thing, I mean, look at the way he's throwing it around, it is impressive, but the second this thing gets hit by anything, it just bursts into flames and the engine destroys itself. So that's a bit of an issue. But some incredible flying there from Strong Soviet Bear, completely outclassed against massively superior numbers and managing to take care of 4 enemy aircraft without firing a single shot, purely by outflying them. That was Strong Soviet Bear in the Lockheed P-80A Shooting Star in War Thunder. I've been the Mighty Jingles, as always. Watch your 6, and I'll catch you next time.